Welcome. My name is Kia. I'm a tech and venture capital reporter at Axios. Hopefully, you're all subscribed to our Pro Rata newsletter. If not, you should. And I am going to have my esteemed panelists super quickly introduce themselves, name, job, and that's it. That's all you get. And then we're going to talk about data.
Hi, I'm Jahnathan. I'm the co-founder and general partner at Tribe Capital.
Hi, everybody. Is this on? Hello, hello. Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Collin West. I'm a co-founding partner of Coffin Fellows Fund.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maryam Haque. I'm the Senior Vice President of Industry Advancement at the National Venture Capital Association.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brijesh. I head up venture fund investments at Adams Street Partners.
Great. Oh, okay. Can you guys hear me? Oh, great. So I'm going to kick it off with kind of a dramatic question, but it should be fun. So my first question to you is, are algorithms and robots going to take all the VC jobs? Anyone, jump in. Educate me.
Oh, man. I guess I'll go for it. So I don't know if they're going to take all VC jobs. I think the thing about data is sometimes it's a little scary, right? And I think the key thing, just with any industry, including venture capital, is to demystify it, right? There's no magic black box on people using data-driven strategies. What we're really trying to do is take something similar to what traditional VCs do. It's you hear this pattern recognition or gut feel on making investment decisions. Really what a GP is saying is, I have this database of deals I've seen, and I have a mental algorithm on what I'm trading on, and kind of 10 or 12 years later, hopefully they've done a good job. And so when I'm applying data to venture, I think the key thing is to really do something similar. It's just scale it up beyond the scope of our own experience and hopefully find true fundamentals to businesses and business ideas that can help you drive alpha for your investors. So, is it going to take over all venture? I don't think in the next few years. But I think if you're avoiding or ignoring data, then of course I'm in the camp that that's a mistake.
I think a good proxy for what might happen in venture is the public equities market. Will the robo-advisors, will quant models, will data and AI take over all the public equity investment jobs in whatever, 10, 15, 20 years? Maybe. And if you believe that's a yes, maybe in venture as well. My personal view is it's unlikely in venture. We always think about the analog of public equities and what's happened in the last 10 years with respect to how we use data. There's always been data in public markets, of course. How we use data to make decisions. And if you contrast on the bookends investing in public equities versus investing in seed or Series A venture, they're very different in terms of how much data is A, generated / exists, and B, how much is accessible, i.e. how much information asymmetry there is or there is not. But that's changing. So even in the seed and Series A stage, there's more data now than say 5 and 10 years ago in terms of usage, adoption, monetization, et cetera, et cetera. And the accessibility of the data is also increasing, and therefore the use of the data by venture investors is increasing. So we're seeing that as a trend. So I don't think it replaces the human element, but it certainly is a big decision support tool in the near term and maybe a partial decision tool in the future.
I was just going to add, I think, if we look at data and it's sort of or robots taking over the investing side of VC, then you basically have hedge funds or, a different asset class. But when we look at venture, the active management after the investment is really where a lot of the sweat and blood and tears go. So, I think at least from the investment side or the deal sourcing side, It's still very nascent and new. Actually, I have some paper here because I wrote down some stats. I don't know if anyone saw this study. It was done by Ilya Strubelev at at Stanford and a few others that wanted to look at how VCs make decisions. And from their survey of like 1,000 VCs, they looked at what were the sources of deal origination over the past 12 months, and 31% of them came from a professional network. That was kind of the highest mark, and 2% was from sort of quantitative sourcing. So I think it's still pretty early. I think there are a lot of different varieties of how firms are tackling this. On one end, I think you have a lot of the more pioneers in that space on the stage here, but at the other end, I've also heard some firms who, I was speaking with like an associate or someone at kind of a larger fund who said when she started working there about a year ago, like they didn't even have any sort of database where they were tracking some of the inbound that they were already getting. So I think there's still a very wide spectrum, and I think for a lot of the more established firms, it's kind of a new thing to kind of take a step back and say, should we change this model of how we have been originating deals? But I think there's separately, from the investing, the deal sourcing side of things, I think there's also a lot of interesting work that's being used, data is being used for sort of the portfolio monitoring and sort of portfolio support side of things, which I'd love to kind of have you all talk a little bit more about what you've been doing.
Jahnathan. Okay, hello. Jahnathan and Collin, if you guys could tell us about the stuff you guys have been doing, because you've been using data in VC for several years now.
Yeah, I want to weigh in on the other one, and then I'm going to sort of segue in. So I'm like a firm no on this. And the reason why is because really it comes down to the word investor, right? The word investor, when venture investors use it, is really deeply different from how a hedge fund person uses it, right? Investing in venture capital supposedly means like sourcing, evaluating, winning, and managing. And when you're a hedge fund person, there's not much to source. The opportunity is all over the place. Winning just means pay the price, and managing. I mean, when you invest in like public company equities, how often is it that you sit down and take phone calls with the founder at 11 p.m. at night? Literally never. So if we take the view that the venture investor is the person who does all of this, or the venture firm is the entity that engages in all of these activities, while a computer might be useful and algorithms might be useful for this sort of central component of possibly decision making or maybe some of the sourcing, it really doesn't have a lot to add to a lot of the rest of it. I mean, even in the sourcing part, maybe an algorithm can help you, tell you who to talk to, but it's not going to go have the conversation. Computers are very bad at having coffee, and they're not good at wearing Patagonia. So it's not we need humans to wear the vests.
That sounds like a challenge. We're gonna have some Patagonia robots soon.
Yeah, you bring up is it going off again? Oh, there we go. You bring up a good point that work still needs to be done. And I think what's really interesting about data is the idea of trying to flip your day as a venture capitalist in a sense. So I know a lot of VCs are running around with kind of this FOMO, this fear of missing out. You're meeting with every company, and when you're meeting with a company, you're thinking about the next company. And you're completely forgettable in many cases. And so, access to great investments is key and important. But what if you could use data to filter down the deals to be much more focused and move away from this kind of buckshot spray and pray and more into a much more focused sniper shot? Not that we're shooting anyone. And so that's one of the ways that we use data so that we can still do our job in a much more efficient way and truly provide real, authentic value to those companies rather than the kind of repetitive hour coffee with no real follow-up.
So there's sourcing and decision making, but I know, Jahnathan, you were telling me that you guys were using data with your portfolio companies.
Yeah, I think when we talk about sort of data broadly, there's one aspect here. So I spent a lot of my career at Facebook, and at Facebook, we talk about how they're really good at data, and we talk about how they use the data to build ad targeting, they use the data to build the feed, all these crazy features, and that's one very clear use of data. But the thing that's sort of underappreciated, I think, on the outside is that at Facebook there are 1,000 people doing data science and analytics. 0 of them are building those features. All of them are working on strategic product decision making. Okay? So what that means is that they're sitting there with the data and they're saying, okay, well, I have some decision to make about building this product, building some feature. How do I use all of the data at Facebook to just help me make a better decision at this point? And Facebook employs an inordinate number of people to do just that. And so when we think about what is it that data can do sort of in venture, there's a component of it that's like we could build things, algorithms to help us leverage the data to do stuff. But there's this whole other part of like sort of, you know, bespoke, custom analysis for strategic decision making, which is actually really where it's had a much larger effect, in my opinion, and also where it has a lot of effect here with these portfolio companies. So when we talk about working with a portfolio company, you know, a portfolio company, they don't really care, you know, like what all the other companies in the world are doing. They're worried about their business, building their business. And then the question becomes, well, given all the data that they have on hand, can that be useful to help them make their own decisions? Is there space to help them get to the next level there? And the answer turns out to be massively yes. This shouldn't be surprising given the thing I said earlier about Facebook. Right.
So, Brijesh, you have all these VCs that are coming to you. The panel before us taught everyone how to raise money, so there's going to be more VCs. They all come to you and they're like, give me your money because we're different. We use data. Like, how do you think about that? Does that mean anything today? Do you assume it's just spreadsheets? Like, how do you think about that as an LP?
The conversations about data in venture and how it's being used has certainly become much more common in venture pitches to LPs. And I see a few LPs in the room. I presume it's the same for them as well. We think of it in a simple framework. So level one use of data and some kind of algorithm that goes with it is to source or to do market mapping. So you're talking about hundreds of deals at this level. Level two is to filter that deal flow to maybe dozens of deals where you spend time. Level three is actually picking and winning, i.e. it's a proxy for the IC process or a support for the IC process. And then level four is using the data and AI in actual company building, product market fit, and so on, some of the things that Jahnathan just touched on. What we find is pretty much any venture firm we talk to these days uses the data at that kind of level one level, i.e. for sourcing and market mapping. Either they do it or they talk about it to LPs like us. Either way, it's part of the conversation. And many are doing it for kind of the filtering step, i.e. going from hundreds to dozens of deals. Not many are using it kind of at that decision-making, IC replacement kind of process. There's a few, of course. But I think that wave is coming. There are more firms now that talk about data and AI as their calling card versus most firms, it's just kind of table stakes, right? You need to have it as part of the toolkit. So I guess that's a long way of saying to your question, it's a pervasive topic now as we talk to venture funds and fundraising these days.
So you're not seeing a lot of people who come in and who are like, we have programs and algorithms, and it's like a fully operating thing that tons of engineers built with money that we're not going to tell you where we got from.
Yeah, without naming specific venture fund names, there are a few firms that have been doing it for a while, and some new entrants as well into that space that I won't say quite look like a quant hedge fund yet, but approach it in terms of having just massive data sets and basically data scientist teams that are cleaning up data, that are working on the decision engines and so on. There's a few challenges, right, to using that in a big way in venture. Once again, I'll contrast to the public equities market. One is the sample sets are smaller. They're big in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, smaller. Second, the feedback loop for whatever algo you're using is very long. And it depends on what you define as success for the feedback loop. In other words, you're investing in a Series A. If success is getting acquired for X million dollars or IPO, well, it's going to take, whatever, 5 to 10 years to find out, right? So that's not a good way to really program what you're optimizing for. So most of the firms we're talking to use some kind of interim step as the success metric, and that could be raising a follow-on round, it getting to a certain number of employees, whatever it is. And as we know, those things could all be false positives. It doesn't mean anything in terms of actual cash-on-cash returns for investors. I think that's part of the struggle. So one is a smaller sample set. Two is the long feedback loops. And three is the data has a lot of noise. So what we hear about from folks like Jahnathan is just how much cleanup and kind of manual almost cleanup it requires to make the data usable from the various sources. So I'll stop there, but we're still in the nascent infancy stages of this, of being, using data in a big way, actionable way in venture, but I see the trend line pointing in one direction.
Speaking of sort of smaller data, what is possible right now? What is not? Especially in the earliest stages, you hear a lot of VCs kind of promotionally say that they invest in people, all this stuff. It's like two dudes in a garage. So like, what is data really gonna do?
Yeah, I like to think that, so I like to say that data and technology is not in and of itself an investment thesis, right? Like you have to have some investment thesis, some view of the world, and then data and technology amplifies your view of the world. Okay, so for us, our history has always been about partnering with great companies and helping them to build good businesses. And then the question is, can we use data to help us do that? If you look for instance, in the quantitative hedge fund world, you could have a viewpoint that like, okay, I believe I can make money because there is some economic phenomena. There is an arbitrage between this asset thing here, this asset thing there. I could execute that and implement that thesis without writing code, right? People have been doing that forever. And then you could theoretically build a machine to do that, but it doesn't replace the underlying investment thesis. And so, the important thing I think, for all of us here is that like data has come out now. That's great, but the question is, what are you going to use it to implement? Like, what's your actual view of the world? What are you trying to do, and how do you use data to help you do that? But it doesn't replace that underlying view of the world. I don't know if that was a question. I might have veered off there. Sorry.
Yeah, so the prevalence of data right now, I think most people in this room would be shocked to know how many firms are at least starting to use data strategies, being founded with a data strategy, or at least trying to amend what they're doing. Certainly LP friends of mine say that. And I'm in a unique situation because I was on the founding fund team of Correlation Ventures, where we were really the first firm to really, at least at our scale, to go out and say we're going to use a data-driven approach. And most rooms we got laughed out of, and it was a really tough go. Now you show up. Yeah, good. She said, "Why is that?" And it was the argument that VC is more art than science, which I think there's certainly a lot of art in venture. So I'm not saying that's not the truth, but the key thing when you think about noise and data or smaller data sets than like the public markets may have is, I think it's really important to remember that you're you're competing against human decision making in a sense, right? So you have this information advantage, and there's certainly more than enough data out there to compete with kind of humans in the way they make their investment decisions. And so I always like to kind of use a parallel. Would it be strange if you wanted to get a loan and from the bank, and you went and sat in front of someone and had to prove your worth and show them your degrees and kind of all of these things, and they kind of look at you and make kind of a judgment on if they should invest in you? Obviously, that's right. That would be rife with incredible amounts of bias and all these broken things to human decision making. And so I think that would be weird to do that without a FICO score and using some data to qualify and really lower risk for lenders. I think today we're in a similar situation. It's actually quite a massive opportunity where this asset class has really avoided using data to help, or at least improve your decision making overall. And so again, the data sets should not and would not be as big as the public market data sets, but also the data sets you build in venture aren't accessible to everyone, so you keep a bigger moat for a longer period of time. And so we learn interesting things, like with our data set, we've learned that at the management level, there's about 100 people across the globe who are really good at picking their next job. you see these people flowing into certain well-named companies, and the valuations of their companies spike over time, and then right before they kind of slow down, you see them flowing out of companies and onto their next company. Well, I want to know where those people are going, right? And so the limits of our own personal brains and networks are tight. Using data, you can scale that up, pay attention to those things, and make sure that you build those networks. And so I've found it to be an incredibly high value thing as we build portfolios.
Just to add to that, I think bringing back the investment in the team and investment in people, that's so common in how venture investors are evaluating opportunities. I think what's really interesting and almost exciting when we think about bringing more data and transparency into decision making is really removing some of the inherent biases that Collin mentioned, to really evaluate opportunities on just a more apples to apples comparison. And I think that could have a lot of interesting test cases when thinking about diversity of entrepreneurs and just access to capital for those that may not have otherwise, but kind of putting it in for sort of more data-driven format, that it does kind of open up the aperture of investors who may not have evaluated or considered this opportunity, but hey, when they stack it up against this other data, it requires or should take an extra look. And I also think even beyond sort of the biases, I think it probably does help open up some of the blind spots that inherently do go into this sort of gut feel of investing, and again, sort of investing in a person rather than taking a step back and looking more at some of the quantitative aspects of what might be a better indicator for success or failure.
Are you seeing any interesting research around data disproving some investor biases that are kind of old and traditional? Or any of you?
So I've seen some data that has, I think, illuminated what have been some indicators for success. Just looking at either their own data or just more industry-wide data. For example, I was reading something the other day, a McKinsey interview with the VC, and one of the things that they learned from looking at their data was that founders where they went to different universities were actually more successful, or were correlated more with higher success. So I think I don't know about the data being able to say yes, this is a good founder, or no, this is not a good founder, but to invest in, or whatever, but to kind of pull out some of these themes of what have been good indicators for success. I think that's the more and more we can kind of crowdsource some of that information, I say, for lack of a better word, from some of these data sets, I think is really interesting. I'm sure there's more. I don't know if you all know of any others.
Okay. Are you guys seeing any sort of interesting tools out there that are sort of available to all kinds of investors? I know people mention things like AngelList quite often. Sort of what's a do-it-yourself data investing strategy?
We are seeing some companies, I think they're both venture-backed, that serve specifically the investor community in assessing both companies and funds. It specifically offers scores around the team. And it's interesting, we're talking about data and research and so on. The approach taken by these different groups is very, very interesting to us, i.e. what they use as inputs, right? There's the obvious stuff like education and LinkedIn profiles and so on. But one of the companies we talked to, for example, scours the web for all the writing and blogging that the founding team has done, and offers scores on everything from empathy to creativity, etc. It's pretty creative, and it's still to be seen how effective that is as a predictor. But we are seeing some interesting approaches to assessing how good an investment is, both on the company side and the fund side.
Yeah, I definitely find that all of the things that we know about, PitchBook, AngelList, I'm familiar with this company, actually, the one that you're talking about. They're great. There's a lot of places to get data. But the thing that I find in a lot of them is this problem that I had mentioned earlier, where they try to substitute investment thesis with data. right? So like, a good example here is like, okay, so, you measure all the attributes personality-wise of someone. That's great, but like, what are you actually looking for, right? Okay, oh, you want the one that is most correlated with success. Oh, well now, we get back to that original problem. Okay, what is success? As we said, success for a hedge fund investor is relatively well defined, right? They invest sort of quarter by quarter, they make money quarter by quarter. If they mess up, you withdraw your money. But for a venture investor, success can mean all sorts of fuzzy, weird things that play out over very long time periods that are, that sort of take all these forms that are very hard to predict. So I think that's the thing that I worry about when I see these tools. The tools are great, but they always have to be used within the context of some view of the world that is preferably explicitly acknowledged.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen the the data scientist in residence that kind of has 3 to 6 months to build something for that Sandhill firm, and I've seen that project get started. They buy all the tools. They have this defined end date where they have to show something, and so they kind of do the classic first step, which is semiotics, like listen to signals online. That's get your app annual subscription and do all these things, and then you bubble up the companies that have the most active users or the most downloads. The trouble is one, that system really only helps the consumer partners of those firms, not the whole firm. And a lot of times really doesn't have enough time to really have the thoughtful building of a true system for it to work. And that person moves on to their next job, and the system falls in disrepair, and then repeat that same issue. And so for me, when I hear the question, do we know any interesting tools, I think I turn a little bit more of an absolutist that I think the real question is, how committed are you as a firm to leveraging data to improve your investment process? And if you are, and I think you have to make a pretty big commitment, and give it a longer period of time, and then the tools will follow. So that's that in between period that a lot of failure occurs.
So we're going to take a few questions from Slido. Reminder, if you want to ask one, you can. So first question, what is the optimal tech stack for a VC, and what is currently missing for that stack? Kind of going off what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. I don't think the technology really matters. I think it's more about the philosophy of what you intend to do with it. I think there's an interesting bit of, this thing has a lot of feedback. There's an interesting bit of history here to think about how data worked. Can you hear me okay without kind of like this? Oh, here? This is better? Oh, that is better. Okay. My bad.
No worries.
So instead of thinking about data in venture, think about how data works in companies, right? If you go back like 100 years ago, companies did use data, right? It was called their accountant. The accountant had the data in their like ledger, and then they would look at it, and then they would make an income statement. That's data science. Data science is big pile of data and make it something useful. Income statement is an example of such. And then, with the advent of the internet, we all of a sudden got a lot more data. And then if you look at companies sort of circa 90s and 2000s, what happened was the companies would have a BI group, business intelligence. There'd be a wall, and they'd throw a question over the wall, and the BI group would throw a dashboard back over the wall, and they'd be like, cool, this is our sales by whatever country, some such, and they would have some data, and they'd move on. But the thing is, if you look at like what has happened sort of in the basically post-social world, the post-social web, in particular in social games, Facebook, and everything after that, what has happened is that the data, it doesn't get thrown over a wall. They've realized, oh, for my decision-making, this thing needs to be like deeply entrenched in how I do everything. And so Facebook has 1,000 data scientists. Uber actually has over 1,000 at this point also. And they sit there with those teams, hand in hand, figuring out how to use the data to do stuff. The technology stack kind of neither here nor there, but it's more about like what, having that thing completely embedded. And so when I think about the future of venture, I think it's largely in the same way. There are a bunch of these large firms that are, as Collin said, experimenting with data science. They're largely approaching it in that throw over the wall way. Oh, here's a wall, data guys, wall, throw a question over, they'll throw me back an answer. That's cool, and that's certainly better than not using it at all. But clearly, the next thing is the thing that companies already presaged for us. One in which the usage of the data is fully integrated into how the company thinks about what it does, or how the venture firm thinks about what it does in the world.
Cool. Okay, so for those on the panel doing data-driven sourcing and dealing, what are the 2 or 3 key data facets you find most useful?
2 or 3 data methods?
Data facets.
Okay, so for us, whenever we're using data to help with sourcing, we're really looking at kind of 3 major buckets of information. We're looking at the talent around the company itself, the tangibles of the business itself, and then the attributes of the timing, the round, why now, why at this valuation. And for us, what we found that's really interesting, just to kind of share a nugget, is I think traditionally a lot of folks using data have looked at investor signals. Those tend to be a very strong signal. So when your top tier firm shows up, then that's a company that maybe would be more likely to be successful. But of course, once that happens, the valuation is also higher. There's access is lower. And so we really find those signals to be a little bit more of a trailing indicator. So by the time that happens, you're too late, right? So you want to be earlier. And what we found is the formation of the team itself is a really interesting leading indicator. How the team comes together, what the attributes of the folks of the team are, and those end up being really interesting things that kind of pop up because you can watch that online. That's a very obvious thing. People are updating their information on teams that they're joining generally. And so the top facet, I guess, that I look at where the company really is all about the people, and it makes sense. It's not rocket science, right? I mean, take a great team matched with an interesting problem. They're much more likely to do well than a poor team matched with an interesting problem. The tough part is just actually identifying what a great team means, and you can do that with data. It's pretty interesting.
So, Jahnathan, I'm going to pick on you for a second. Social Capital did the Capital as a Service experiment. What are some lessons, good and bad, from that experiment?
Well, I haven't been at Social Capital for the last 3 months, so I don't know exactly what's been going on there. But when I was there, one of the things that worked, I think one of the theory behind it was as follows. We had an approach of viewing the world that we thought that we could understand if a business was working on relatively very little data, and we had a lot of reasons to believe that approach was valid. I wrote a bunch of articles about it. Feel free to read them. Not secret, right? It's all there. And we thought that viewpoint was useful, and then we had this belief that there were companies all around the world that were hitting some level of product market fit, and that we could invest in them based on basically building a machine that would do that work. And largely that works. You can do that. You can build such a thing. You generate a lot of applicants, and you can deploy money that way. It turns out to be difficult to write checks all over the world, but that's another separate problem. I think one of the tricky things about it is really knowing if it's working, right? It goes back to that problem I mentioned earlier. Like, okay, the feedback cycle when you're writing a small check halfway around the world, how do you know if it worked? Oh, I'm gonna have to wait like 7 years. Well, okay, that means that, how do I iterate? It makes iteration very difficult. So I think that was, kind of the pluses and minuses of that. But I think that the core, I like to say that there's kind of like accounting and there's QuickBooks, right? QuickBooks is like a software implementation of accounting. Whether QuickBooks works or not is kind of separate from whether accounting works. So our viewpoint is very much like we have a way of viewing the world that's more like accounting. Capital as a Service is an example of trying to build QuickBooks, and a little bit different.
Interesting. Next question. How do you avoid bias based on the data you're looking at, and how do you know that you're looking at the right data and asking the right questions? For anyone.
Okay. I love this stuff. Bias. Okay. So the wonderful thing about data is that at its truest form, it is implicitly unbiased, right? I can sit here and say, Collin is tall. Well, the word tall is actually biased because maybe I grew up in North America, people are kind of taller, right? But if I say Collin is 6'3", are you 6'3"? Yeah, 6'3", that is unbiased. That's just a fact, right? He is simply 6'3". And so the wonderful thing about data, in its sort of purest form, there's no bias there. You're not trying to build a model on top of it. You're merely stating something that is. And using data to merely state what is sort of that first level of the utility of data, and that's really where we spend a lot of our time. Now, when you try to use it to predict the future, invariably you're going to like build a model on top of it, and that model is going to do things, possibly introduce bias. But even that first level of merely understanding what is, you know, data is ground truth in its like purest form, and ground truth is, you know, unbiased in and of itself. Now, how you use it may be biased, but the data itself isn't.
You know, this is an interesting one. This is something we talk about with venture firms that do talk about using data. The data fields are, of course, unbiased, but the question we ask is, which data fields are you picking, and how do you weight them to make decisions? And that process is not unbiased. So if you're picking a basketball team, obviously you need to look at height, but if you're looking at who makes a good venture investor, in our case, or who makes a good entrepreneur, it's really non-linear what sets of data fields will be a good predictor for that. So we struggle with that, and I know we need much more time to hash that out, but just that's an interesting point that we frankly struggle with.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Because you're the token LP on the panel here. Have any of these data-driven sort of decision-making processes kind of made their way over to how LPs are also looking at making investment opportunities, or is that sort of next stage or next phase, or I don't know if you've been thinking about that?
We do think about will data disrupt our business, and I think at some point, depending on your time horizon, the answer is yes. We are thinking about how we use data to make better decisions at our level as well, and it's even trickier. It's kind of a meta decision on who can pick the best companies, so we don't have a good answer yet, but we're certainly thinking about it.
Awesome. So we are done. Thank you so much to the panel.